For those of you who saw part 6 of Hurricane Week, this doesn't really show anything different to what you already saw. It just shows the top 10 one by one without any breaks or intermissions. Kicking off our top 10 is the Okeechobee hurricane of 1928. Not many people are around to tell us about this storm anymore, but it was a bad one. A Category 5 storm that affected Florida but first began over the Leeward Islands and became a Category 5 over Puerto Rico and then headed towards Florida, striking the Bahamas along the way and then making landfall not far from Palm Beach and then moving over Lake Okeechobee. This storm of course peaked as a Category 5 storm, winds of 160 miles an hour. Its pressure reached a minimum of 929 millibars reported, but its severe consequences, mainly due to flooding around Lake Okeechobee, led to over 4,000 fatalities. Of course, beyond Florida as well, with that big landfall in Puerto Rico and the Lesser Antilles too, 218,000 buildings were damaged as a result of this storm, which would generate $1.38 billion of damages adjusted for inflation. Most of the damage and fatalities did occur in Florida and the rest of the United States, of course, but a lot of lives were lost in the Lesser Antilles, around 1,500, which is just less than half of the full total of over 4,000. Tragic storm at number 10. At number 9, a North Indian Ocean cyclone, Cyclone Sarika, which reached a peak intensity as a Cat 5 before making landfall as a weakened Category 4 storm in Bangladesh, but the damage would still be done. 160 miles an hour was its peak, 944 millibars, rather high for this 2007 storm. Just the one landfall at 130 miles an hour, but look at what it caused. $1.7 billion of damages, but more critically, 15,000 fatalities and over 300,000 buildings damaged. What's more, it caused one of the largest evacuations in history too, the second largest that we have on our top 100. And here's some of the damaged pictures. You can see boats washed ashore, the trees heavily damaged and defoliated, flooding running rampant in the immediate aftermath of the storm. Just carnage all over the place, really, as you'd expect from a storm of this intensity, sadly, but in such a, in some places impoverished and such a largely populated area as the coast of Bangladesh, it was obviously going to spell trouble no matter where this storm went. And now we move on to number 8, which is Super Typhoon Mike, a late season storm in the West Pacific in the 1990 hurricane season, typhoon season even. The storm passing through the Micronesian islands, passing just north of Palau as a strong Category 4, coming on Cat 5, and maintained Cat 5 intensity for a while before making landfall in the Philippines around Leyte as a Category 4 storm and then passing through. Re-strengthening in the South China Sea, but moving north, moving clear of Vietnam, and eventually making landfall on Hainan as a tropical storm. But the damage had already been done. First of all, its peak intensity, it was quite a strong storm. It had a pinhole eye at one point, looked very impressive. 175 miles an hour, its minimum central pressure 915 millibars. 7 landfalls in the end, probably thanks to the Philippines. 140 miles an hour was its first, with $389 million of damages associated with the storm. It killed over 750, but the biggest and most staggering fact about Typhoon Mike is that it damaged or destroyed more than 850,000 buildings, an incomprehensible total. Here's satellite imagery of the storm now. And now we move on to number 7, which is the Odisha cyclone of 1999. A strong storm which peaked as a Category 5 just before landfall. In fact, the strongest storm that the North Indian Ocean had ever seen. Peaking with winds of 160 miles an hour, but a pressure of 912, which is the lowest that we've seen in the North Indian Ocean. What's more, it caused a hell of a lot of problems as well. Landfalling at 155 miles an hour, $4.5 billion of damages, with 10,000 fatalities on top. nearly 300,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed as well as a result of this terrible storm. Another bad one for India, which they often seem to get time and again. At number 6, a 600-mile wide wrecking ball headed straight for Japan in the form of Typhoon Veera, a Category 5 storm that it gained to the northwest of the Mariana Islands and maintained all the way until landfall in Japan, the only such storm ever to do that, in September 1959. Hitting central Japan right through the heart, I suppose, it caused untold damages and fatalities, with a maximum sustained wind of 190 miles an hour during its peak, with a pressure of 895 millibars. Its first landfall as a Cat 5, causing $4.8 billion of damages if it were to happen today, or adjusted for inflation for today at least. And over 5,000 fatalities, one of Japan's deadliest storms ever, and one of the most destructive buildings-wise, with nearly 1 million buildings damaged or destroyed from this storm. Veera rightfully reaches number 6 on Force 13's Hurricane Week 2015, even though not many people may have heard of it necessarily, but it was an atrocious storm for Japan that they do not see very often, if at all.
Hurricane Mitch will not only go down as one of the most powerful Atlantic hurricanes on record at 905 millibars, but will also go down as the deadliest Atlantic hurricane since reliable records go back to 1851. Only one storm, the Great Atlantic Hurricane of 1780, caused more deaths in the Atlantic Basin. The storm produced extremely heavy rainfall, as it basically stalled out directly before making landfall in Central America. And it's not just Honduras and Nicaragua that was affected by the storm, but rains from the Yucatan Peninsula all the way down to Panama were extreme. A total of 19,325 deaths are confirmed from the storm, though the death toll may be as high as 22,000 in some cases. Damages also go well above $5 billion.
Mitch is also the second deadliest storm that we have on our whole list this evening. At number 4 is a bolt out of the blue in 1992, Hurricane Andrew, which formed in the central Atlantic and became a tropical storm, passed to the north of the Lesser Antilles, not delivering too much to those islands, and then turned towards the west, and then all hell broke loose in the Bahamas, but more importantly in Florida. The Bahamas got away relatively lightly considering its Category 5 landfall, but Florida also got hit with a Cat 5 landfall, and Homestead was pretty much demolished. The storm then went on to Louisiana, making a Category 3 landfall there. It peaked with winds of 175 miles an hour, a minimum pressure of 922 millibars. 4 landfalls in the end, 165 miles an hour, the strongest one, and $44 billion of damages adjusted for inflation in today's money. 274,000 buildings damaged in the end, and over 1 million evacuations.
Hurricane Andrew ended up being the first hurricane of the 1992 Atlantic hurricane season, and the only major hurricane to occur. So you would think that, the season was rather inactive. What could this storm have done?
Andrew started out like any other tropical storm in the central Atlantic on August 17th, and after tracking for a few days, passing the Lesser Antilles and moving off towards the north, it turned towards the west, and that's when it started to intensify.
This storm, although it was the only major hurricane of the 1992 season, packed an absolute wallop, as it was known as the costliest U.S. hurricane on record until Katrina happened. The storm was rather a small, modest system, moving to the north and west since it was formed, and then it ended up getting underneath an influence of a subtropical ridge that was centered around Savannah, Georgia, and it was moving along the south of it. The storm ended up picking up the Gulf Stream, and it rapidly intensified from a strong tropical storm to a Category 5 hurricane in less than 48 hours. The storm would end up going across the Bahamas and making landfall at 165 miles per hour.
Andrew was the strongest storm to strike the Bahamas in nearly 30 years. Though despite that, it did only cause 4 fatalities thanks to awareness on the Bahamas. However, there was still a toll in terms of damage, with 800 homes destroyed and 1,700 people left homeless.
And weakening a little bit before ending up making landfall in Florida, where it made landfall in Homestead, and that's where most of the damage was caused. After it moved across Florida, it would end up affecting central and western Louisiana as a smaller Category 4 cyclone, and then ending up moving up to the north and east overland and dissipating, merging with the remnants of Hurricane Lester.
It's amazing to think how these images could be created from a hurricane, but one person who knows all too well about this is someone who was in the storm, TropMet's Michael Lacker.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
I have a power line down and we don't know where to call. Do you have a number?
We'll announce it on the air, okay?
Okay, thank you.
I understand that there's quite a bit of heavy damage at Homestead Air Force Base, extensive damage. If you need repair, emergency sort of breathing a sigh of relief, those in Broward and Palm Beach County.
Right now, emergency units are on the scene. That's the 3200 block of Northeast 9th Street.
Thank you for calling.
It was not far from here where Andrew's highest waves were reported, at up to 17 feet or 5 metres. Whilst accurate wind information isn't available for the point of landfall, it's highly plausible that wind gusts exceeded 180 miles per hour, sustained winds well into Category 5 intensity. 90% of mobile homes were damaged here in Miami-Dade County, and over 100,000 homes were damaged in total, a fairly incomprehensible amount illustrated by its $25 billion price tag at the time in 1992, so it would be significantly more in 2014 dollars. High winds extended southwards onto the Upper Keys, and some more damage occurred there, but not as severe or widespread as to what was witnessed here. Light to moderate damage was also seen on the western coast from Lee County southwards. 44 were killed in Florida state during the passage of the storm. I'm standing between what's left of 2 trees that stood before Hurricane Andrew made landfall, and this is pretty much exactly where it did make landfall 22 years ago on the Florida mainland after it first crossed Elliott Key a few miles east of here. The hurricane was packing winds in excess of 160 miles per hour as it moved inland just north of Homestead and continued westwards, emerging over the Gulf of Mexico, still as a severe storm, of course, before making its final landfall on the Gulf Coast. Andrew then moved on to Louisiana, where it made landfall as a weak Category 3 hurricane, if weak is a term for it, with 115 mph winds. It also caused 14 tornadoes there and damaged thousands of homes in the state also. However, Andrew will always be remembered for the damage that it caused in Florida primarily, where damages totaled several tens of billions.
Hurricane Katrina is by far the worst disaster to ever occur in the United States, with damages totaling over $110 billion in today's damages, as it inundated the entire city of New Orleans. But one of the things that I really remember about this system is how everyone was getting so excited for Hurricane Katrina's landfall in the Miami area as an 85-mile-per-hour hurricane, because Miami had not had a hurricane since Andrew of 1992. And everyone was panicking, like, oh my god, we need to get ready for the system. And they ended up doing a really good job, and no one really focused on what its effects would be on the Gulf Coast, as they were expecting the hurricane to be a Category 2 landfall on the peninsula of Florida, very close to where Dennis made landfall, just at a much weaker intensity. However, the storm caught everybody off guard, as not only did the storm jog significantly to the west, the storm also ended up rapidly intensifying to a Category 5 storm almost directly before its landfall. And 24 hours before its landfall, or even 18 hours before its landfall, there was a Category 5 system lurking off the coast of Louisiana, and then it ended up coming up the coast, flooding Lake Pontchartrain and causing 30-foot storm surges along the Mississippi coast, and the rest was history.
Of course, once the storm was in the Gulf, the hurricane hunters were all over it right up until landfall. Here's some of the radar imagery that they gathered whilst they were on their flights, and here's some of the images from their flights as well. Fantastic images from inside Katrina's eye.
High sustained wind speeds were 175 miles an hour and the air pressure was 902 millibars. Fatalities totaled 1,833, most of which were in the Gulf Coast of the United States. And the damage totaled $108 billion, the costliest cyclone ever recorded. Although it wasn't as bad as expected at landfall, only landfalling as a Category 3 hurricane on the Saffir-Simpson scale, which I believe was one good thing for New Orleans and all the northern Gulf Coast as well. And the storm surge was also very frightening too. Looking at one of the documentaries made when they were actually in the storm, and it was alarming when it was coming up to the Biloxi Coliseum.
One of the most remarkable things about this storm, in my opinion, is the fact that it could have been worse. If it wasn't for an eye wall replacement cycle and dwindling conditions just before its landfall, around a day before its landfall, Katrina could have made a much stronger landfall. It was 125 miles an hour in the end, but it could have been a Cat 4, goodness, even a Cat 5 landfall. And it's something I suppose that people all along the Gulf Coast should be preparing for that eventuality one day, for something worse than Katrina. Could you imagine it? Yet it is probably possible. There are literally thousands of images like these showing the sheer scale and extent of the devastation that was wrought upon the coasts of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and even Florida to a small extent, extending far inland as well, because the storm maintained a lot of intensity, or at least a lot of its rainfall inland too. Imagine how long we would be here if we showed every single photo for 10 seconds. We'll probably end up doing a 24-hour streaming service for the next week. At number 2, we go back to 1991 and one of the worst storms you could ever fathom, really. The Bangladesh cyclone, which formed in the Bay of Bengal that April and then moved towards the north, eventually becoming a remarkable Category 5 storm before making landfall near that intensity with wind speeds of 155 miles an hour in Bangladesh. It wasn't its intensity that was the biggest thing about this storm, though it still was rather strong, 160 miles an hour, its pressure 918 15 millibars, not far off the strongest storm ever in that region. But the damage is 1.7 billion, still not that bad compared to some, but the fatality count, 138,000. But on top of that, 2 million buildings damaged or destroyed by the storm, and 2 million evacuees. One of the worst storms you will probably ever see, certainly one of the worst Category 5 storms that you'll have ever seen in recent times. This one occurring in 1991, of course, arguably worse than the Bowler cyclone of 1970. There it is, making landfall. A very strong storm and tragic as well. That's number 2 on Hurricane Week 2015. And now to number 1, and this storm needs no introduction. Super Typhoon Haiyan.
The storm was a late season storm forming in November 2013, starting out in the open Pacific on November 3rd. The storm became a typhoon only 2 days after forming. Soon after, rapid deepening ensued, and the storm became a Category 5 super typhoon only 36 hours after becoming a typhoon, and intensified further to winds of 195 miles an hour and air pressure of 895 millibars before striking the Philippines at that intensity.
So why is Haiyan number 1? Absolutely unparalleled in its landfall, 195 miles an hour. 6 landfalls in total over the Philippines. It caused a hell of a lot of damage. It caused most likely over 7,000 fatalities. And obviously damages well over 2 billion, probably closer to 3. Buildings damaged 572,900, and there were a further 536,500 that were destroyed completely by this storm. It caused absolute misery and total destruction in the Tacloban region of the island of Leyte in the Philippines. And people often ask me, how often will we ever see a storm like this again? When will we see another Haiyan? Will it be tomorrow? Will it be in 10 years? I do think that these storms are more common than people might think. Certainly out at sea, it's just very unlucky that this storm did make landfall near its peak intensity. Very rare in that sense. But these storms, yeah, not as rare as people might think, and it could possibly be, it could happen any time, of course, but generally you're probably looking at least 1 in every 100 years that you'd see a storm as bad as this strike the Philippines at this intensity. Speculative perhaps, but probably true. Needless to say, this was one of the deadliest storms of the Philippines in modern times, one of the deadliest storms in the Western Pacific since the new millennium. And look at the pictures on the ground after the storm passed through. Places unrecognisable of their former selves before the storm arrived. And even though many storms have produced these kind of effects in the past, we've seen plenty of them during our top 100. Even though it is a recent storm and there may still be possibly 1 or 2 accusations of hype perhaps over Haiyan, or just bias because it was a recent storm, I still think, pound for pound, with its massive landfall of 195 miles an hour, that Haiyan takes it as the top 1 in the top 100 of Force 13's Hurricane Week 2015.